Is it possible to make a short comment?
Please.
So I think it's a common theme in many of the talks, but especially this one. And I'm not an MD. I'm a prospective patient, maybe. And I think, the challenge of healthcare today is not really extending longevity, but the healthy part of the lifespan. And I think focused ultrasound has this unique capability to offer long life with good quality of life. And these attributes must be highlighted, zoomed, I don't know what, in all those studies and all the communication to the outside world. Because what I saw here is mainly clinical indicators aimed at convincing the clinical community. And we know this has been an uphill battle, and it's going to continue to be an uphill battle. And the only change will come from the patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's the importance of these registries and the clinical trials is to produce evidence to convince people that it's worthwhile. So what we've heard is a little bit about design, infrastructure, and a good example. So now we're going to turn it to the rest of our panel. So could you introduce yourself, your company, your role, and your registries, and what indications, and what's been their main use so far? Mark, can you want to start?
Sure. Mark Carroll, Sonicare Medical. We have a device that received de novo regulatory authorization for prostate tissue ablation in 2015. Shortly thereafter, we began the process of putting together a Sonicare dedicated registry. We have partners in Europe where the device has been used for many years, in the UK, that had established an institution REDCap compliant registry that had been in effect for several years, and we co-opted that, if you will. We created a partition in that registry for US patients. The data collection is the same. The format is the same. They just, physicians in the US who participate, load that into a separate part. The data can be pooled if the participants are interested in doing so. In the European partition right now, there's close to 2,000 patients. In the US partition, there's close to around 400 patients. We have academic and non-academic participants alike. We felt it was important, per some of the comments on the slides, to make sure that this was a real-world experience. That said, there are two defining groups within the U.S. registry data. There is a group of individuals who are using the registry, if you will, as their database. So they load their patients into that. They've loaded past patients that have been treated since regulatory authorization, and they're loading ongoing patients. And then we have a group of users, mostly academic users, who have banded together to do a prospective enrollment in the registry. Under IRB approval, we're looking at using they are looking at using the nascent NIH IRB group. And that data will be collected prospectively in anticipation of a publication, and that's the reason for informed consent on all of the patients and IRB oversight. In the prospective registry, we've made the difficult, I keep on saying we, Sonicare has supported the infrastructure for this registry. The registry itself is run by a governing body made up of the users, and they've made the proactive decision that biopsy data will be required to be part of the prospective IRB approved registry, because the feeling exists, and perhaps Dr. Viviano can address this in his talk, that biopsy data will be necessary for not only ongoing regulatory submissions that are possible with the technology, but also for professional society acceptance and oversight. Doing biopsies in the U.S. is not an easy thing to do, especially since, for those of you who don't know, in order to get an MRI, you have to do the biopsy first. To get the MRI covered by insurance, you have to do the biopsy first. But the natural clinical pattern of care is to do the MRI to determine whether you need to do a biopsy. So that's a quandary that we're trying to deal with. We have great expectations for this. We believe that we'll be able to enroll upwards of several thousand patients a year, looking at both the side effect profiles and the downstream clinical outcomes. And just before I pass the baton on, I do want to let any of you know that are interested in going into the prostate cancer space or the prostate ablation space, that it is a requirement that you shave your head first.
Thanks, Mark.
It's on, I think.
It's already on.
Just use this one.
Okay, just go with that. All right, thanks, Mark. My name is Matt Hull. I'm Director of Quality and Regulatory for EDAP Technomed, part of EDAP TMS in France. And as Mark said, we're also involved in a different study in the prostate ablation space. It's called the 4USA. We're supporting that study, and it's being led by University of Miami. And they started just over a year ago. Actually launched it about 2 years ago. We had our first user meeting, and I know one of the issues was asked about like getting physician involvement, and that was a key for us in getting the registry started. From the get-go, that's where we addressed it right at the beginning. Make sure that everybody that wanted to be involved was committed to doing that, and that was our start point. And then it took us about a year to be ready to launch. And like I said, that just happened about a year ago. And it's got participation not only by University of Miami, but institutions such as Cleveland Clinic, Duke, Houston Methodist, USC, and Weill Cornell Medical Center. And again, as Mark said, it's the same database we're using also. It's the REDCap compliant database for that.
My name is Matthew Burtnick. I'm the Director of Clinical Affairs at Profound Medical, based in Toronto in Canada. We manufacture two devices, the Tulsa Pro prostate ablation device, MRI guided, as well as the Sonolive, which is an MRI guided extracorporeal HIFU system. The Sonolive has CE mark approval for uterine fibroids and painful bone metastases, as well as in a number of other countries that recognize the CE mark approval. We received Chinese FDA approval for the fibroid indication earlier in the summer. The Tulsa Pro prostate ablation device, we also have CE mark approval for it, as well as a few other countries that recognize the CE mark approval. We do not have regulatory approval for either of the devices in the United States at the moment. We recently completed a prospective clinical trial for the purposes of registration with the FDA, which we hope to do next year. So this time next year, hopefully we have some good news to share from that perspective. So we do not have an actual open registry at the moment, but we're certainly considering setting one up. There's a variety of reasons that I think a registry is useful, but I think specifically in the prostate space, which I'm sure my panelists here can agree to, there are several challenges that I think we really need to be critical of. To determine what the data from these registries are going to provide and what impact is that going to have on the field. And I think we can discuss that a little bit more in the next questions. Whereas for other diseases, I think registries are a fantastic way to get sort of long-term data that can support clinical adoption of these technologies.
Thank you. And I would invite people from the audience that have questions to go to the mics, and we'll take questions as we have time to do. There are many stakeholders that are interested in registry data. Can you give us an idea of how you're using this data to go forward, or how you plan to use it going forward? And maybe Matthew, we'll start with you and work back.
Sure. I mean, definitely there are many stakeholders, from the patient through to the physician, through the manufacturer, through to professional societies, through to regulatory bodies, payers. My comment earlier about specifically in the prostate space, I think we need to be very critical about what data we're going to gather, how we're going to gather it, and what those outcomes are going to be. And if we think that's going to be a data set that can be useful for these particular stakeholders. So overall, and again, I want to preface that this is kind of specific to the prostate space because of all the challenges involved with essentially demonstrating effectiveness of treatment of localized prostate cancer in the sense of small effect sizes and et cetera. At the end of the day, you want, everybody likes more data. So I mean, there's no question about that. I think there are some clear benefits from stakeholders such as regulatory bodies that do either require or encourage the manufacturers to acquire post-market sort of surveillance type data to ensure that from a new technology perspective, when it's being used in the real world, there's nothing that's happening that was not included in the initial regulatory submissions. For example, in Europe, there's a new medical device regulation or an update to a medical device regulation, which is significantly increasing the onus on the manufacturer to obtain proactive post-market data, which is very different than a passive post-market data. And proactive means sort of like a manufactured, sponsored registry, for example, where we are actively seeking data from the use of our device instead of sort of waiting for something to happen and then hearing about it afterwards. So even a nationally funded registry, for example, would not be considered proactive in this space because you don't see the data until the publications come out, essentially. So on the flip side, so I mean, there's certainly value there. On the flip side, in the prostate space, we keep talking about essentially randomized controlled data to show specific outcomes that are going to be sufficient to convince professional societies and payers that the device is effective. So I think from that perspective, we need to think about is a registry going to provide such a data set that would be strong enough to achieve those goals? And at the moment, I don't know if we've figured that out yet exactly. And then lastly, just on the patient side, my last comment is that certainly in the gentleman before who asked the question, I think it's critical that we incorporate more patient-centric information, not only to provide information to the patient, but to communicate what the patients are thinking through to these other stakeholders. And the FDA published a great review paper earlier this year on HIFU outcomes and made a point on patient preference information and how important that can be in assessing some of these technologies. And I think that's an area that all of us as a field could improve, especially in these days of cell phones. I mean, I'm thinking, get the patient to input their data proactively. There should be mechanisms that are not overly burdensome from a cost perspective, where we should be able to get comprehensive information from these patients.
Great, and I'll tell you, we're running out of time, so let's try to make these brief as we get on for any other answers that your other ones have on this important topic, because we're going to get ended momentarily.
Can I just make a quick comment on registries? I think and registries in concept are great. I think we can get to a lot of information that can support both regulatory and payer outcomes. The problem, especially in the U.S., Peji hinted at this or really nailed it on the head when there's a chasm here because registries assume, registries in general are for devices that are already FDA cleared, but the problem is that the insurance clearance hasn't occurred. And so the question is, how do you enroll patients in registries when and insurance won't cover it, with the end goal being that, well, once we have the data, that should support it. There's a big missing link here in terms of getting registries going, especially in the United States, for that gap where there isn't clearance, where there's clearance, but there isn't funding for these procedures.
Well, and actually, just sorry to add quickly to that, we did hear from a speaker yesterday that was talking exactly about that, and maybe looking at policies where there is some form of payment initially, specifically for patients that are being input into the registry, and then at some point in the future, sort of reassess that if they want to continue to pay or stop the payments, because it is a chicken and egg problem, and how do we get out of that? We really need to think outside the box.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, and I know I'll get in trouble if we run over, so there's plenty more to discuss that, and we can discuss this more with these folks in the break. I want to thank everybody for being here, and we'll go on to the next portion.